So welcome to this talk, an introductory talk on Latin American cinema at Oxford. My name is Ben Bollig and I'm the tutor in Spanish at St Catherine's College, Oxford. I also look after Spanish at St John's and I teach Latin American literature and film for the faculty. So there's a number of ways that you can study Latin American film here at Oxford. Anyone doing the Spanish sole or single honours degree in the first year does what we call a paper or a module entitled An Introduction to Hispanic Cinema. And on that you look at a wide range of film, but 4 films specifically in Spanish, 2 of which are from Latin America. Then in the final year of your studies you can also take what we call a special paper or an optional module, which is entitled Latin American Cinema, and that's open to students of Spanish and Portuguese. Those of you who do Portuguese also have an additional option of studying another module or optional module, again we call these special papers, on Brazilian cinema. So that's students of Portuguese can specifically study Brazilian cinema. But I should mention that on the Latin American cinema option, you also very much, even if you don't do Portuguese, you very much have the option of doing films in Portuguese, Brazilian films as part of that. On top of the formal aspect of the studies, there's also other activities, film-related events and talks. We host here a Brazil week, a week of cultural activities, talks, film screenings, etc., dedicated to Brazil and Brazilian studies. And I also organise what's called the Argentine Cultural Forum, or the Foro Argentino de Cultura, which is normally a week of events dedicated to Argentine culture. And this year, just recently, we've had an interview with the Argentine director, Gustavo Fontan, talking about his cinema. So as I said, in the first year, one of the options is an introduction to Hispanic film, and there are 2 Latin American films on that. The first of these is a film called Memories of Underdevelopment, or Memorias del Subdesarrollo, directed by Tomás Gutiérrez Alea. It's a Cuban film from 1968. It's a very critically and indeed commercially successful film in its day, won a variety of prizes. And it's an example of, a really interesting example of political cinema, of film that attempts to engage with contemporary political issues. In this case, it portrays a character, Sergio, who's a kind of disaffected, disengaged intellectual who's observing the events of the Cuban Revolution, but without ever being sure whether he should get involved or not. The second film from Latin America that first year students are able to do is a film called Camila. And Camila is directed by the great Argentine filmmaker Maria Luisa Bemberg, who made a series of really fascinating films through the 1980s and 1990s, often dealing with Argentine history and often in a rather melodramatic style. But at the same time, these aren't films that can just be dismissed as over the top or excessively emotional, because there's a very intelligent use of that melodramatic style to ask searching questions, often about the history, both the distant history of Argentina and also recent historical events. And in the case of Camila, what we have is a historical drama that deals with a scandal that occurred in the 19th century, a relationship between a priest, as you can see in the image, Ladislao on the left, and a young woman of very aristocratic family, Camila O'Gorman, and they went on to have a relationship which scandalized Argentine society at the day and led eventually to rather extreme punishment on the part of the government of the day, and something of a scandal at the time. But what's interesting about the film is, while on the one hand it is a historical drama, so it tells the story of Camila and this relationship and this scandal and the tragedy that ensued, but also throughout there's a series of hints that much of what is being described could also be appropriate to more recent historical events in Argentina. In this case, the dictatorship that ruled from the end of the 1970s until the early 80s, and that was very much at the foremost of people's memories and experience when this film was released. And this is why some film critics have talked about it as a kind of collective catharsis. That's to say, a film that enabled people to examine recent events by looking at the distant past. And here the melodrama, rather than just being a sort of over-the-top emotional genre, is one that enables a type of historical allegory, so an analysis of distant events, analysis of contemporary events, but using events from the distant past. In the final year, then, students have the option of taking what we call a special paper or a module on Latin American cinema. And although we do give clear guidance and workshops on how to look at a film, how to write on a film, there's a series of lectures about the films of different nations within Latin America, Brazil, Chile, Argentina, Mexico. It's very much a student-led option. And students, it's really extraordinary the different films that they're able to find and that they decide to study, everything from Paraguayan thrillers through to Bolivian science fiction, Ecuadorian road movies. It's an extraordinary variety of films that students have studied and worked on. There are, of course, some classics, and there are some films that students keep coming back to. One of them is a Brazilian film from 2002, Cidade de Deus, City of God, directed by Fernando Meirelles and Katia Lund. And this is a film that deals with questions around poverty and violence and race and racism in Argentina. It's set in a favela, one of the informal settlements that are found in the city of Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. It uses a lot of child actors and non-professional actors. It has a very authentic feel about it. And on top of that, it also used some innovative and improvised techniques. There's a very memorable scene which actually runs up to the image that you can see on the screen, in which character is chasing a chicken. And to try and get that kind of very low to the ground point of view shot, rather than using a more traditional, what we call a dolly, which is a little kind of trolley on wheels, they pushed around a cameraman on a skateboard to create this kind of frenetic, hyperkinetic feel that the film has. As I said, we look at films from Chile as well, and one of the standout directors in recent years from that country is Pablo Larraín. Larraín is probably Chile's most famous director. He's made films in Hollywood, such as Jackie, about Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis. Currently making a film about Princess Diana as well. No is the third in a trilogy of films that he made about the history of his own country, of Chile. And it tells a story of a plebiscite or an election which the dictatorship of General Pinochet called in the hope of being allowed to extend their rule over the country with the acquiescence, with the permission of the general public, so a kind of legal dictatorship almost. And it tells the campaign of those who were against that, the No campaign, and how they use contemporary advertising techniques and contemporary media techniques to turn a negative into a positive and to make people want to vote no, to vote against Pinochet. And again, it's a film that's technically really interesting. Larraín remade cameras, kind of repurposed contemporary cameras from the 1980s so that the film would look like it was itself archive footage. So there is actual archive footage, but there's also footage that they shot using these sort of Super 8 type cameras so that it had an authentic contemporary look about it. And at the same time also, it's not just a sort of heroic story, a happy ending story. It's a film that looks critically at Chile's transition to democracy and asks the question of how much really changed with the return of civilian, democratically elected government. We also look at some films from Central America, and one recent film that's proved very popular with students is a film called Ichcanul. And it's a very interesting film. It's from Guatemala, not a country with a massive filmmaking tradition, but it's also one of the first feature films made in Mayan language, in this case Cachiquel. which is an indigenous language of that country and the region. And it's a film that deals with questions of injustice, of personal frustration, of a teenage girl growing up in rural Guatemala. And it's won a series of prizes. It made its non-professional actor star into a relatively famous figure. And it's really interesting because of its attempt to transpose the aesthetics of a feature film into a very different environment, and in this case also a different language. As I said, one of my particular areas of interest is Argentina and Argentine film, and a recent Argentine film from 2017, Sama, directed by Lucrecia Martel, is one of those films from Latin America that's really kind of completely transcended any sense of national cinema. This was a film that featured in many British and American and continental European film critics lists of the best films of the 2010s, of the 2000s even. It's a critically acclaimed film, a prize-winning film, and it tells the story, an adaptation of a novel by Antonio Di Benedetto, an Argentine novelist who's thoroughly worth reading. It's a story of waiting. It tells a story during the colonial era of a diplomat who's been posted to what nowadays is Paraguay, and then was part of the viceroyalty of the River Plate, and he's desperate to leave. And over years and over decades, he tries to find a way to get sent somewhere else, because he can never adjust to life in what for him feels like the ends of the earth. And he wants to desperately get somewhere which is cool, where he's not isolated and he's in touch with what he regards as civilization. And that leads him very much to sort of ignore everything that's going on around him. This particular shot where he's got a llama or an alpaca looking over his shoulder is part of this deadpan humour that Martel uses, this very subtle humour that Martel uses, really to sort of mock some of the features of the colonial era and the colonial hierarchies, but at the same time also, as Peter Bradshaw says, horror and despair hover just out of frame. So this is a film that deals very much with the violence of colonisation and the colonial legacy, and it's a film I thoroughly recommend for anybody as a really interesting way into contemporary Argentine and contemporary Latin American film. So I hope that gives you a sense of the very many ways in which you can study film here, Latin American film here, as part of the course in Spanish or the course in Portuguese at the University of Oxford. And I very much hope that I'll see some of you, will be inspired to apply and come and join us. So thank you very much.